So Tina, what did you think when you first heard about these symptoms that people with long COVID were experiencing?
Well, the first thing that struck me was that they were incredibly familiar to me, because in my clinic we have expertise in diagnosing and helping people with histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome, and the list is exactly the same: the chronic fatigue, the aches and pains, the brain fog, etc. It was just like reading symptoms from one of my patients.
And so what is histamine intolerance, which is one of the things that you treat people for, and how could it be relating to COVID-19?
Well, histamine is made in the body and it's stored in various cells, and it has some very important functions to do. So it's particularly in the mast cells, which are involved in immunity. And I think that's where it comes in with COVID-19, or any virus actually. So it's made and stored in the mast cells, in the basophils, in the platelets, and in our neurons, and in some of our gut cells. And it helps in the gut to release acid in our stomachs so that we can digest protein and absorb protein. In the neurological system, it is a neurotransmitter, and it helps us with wakefulness and our circadian rhythm, and with our cognition, our thought processes. And in our mast cells, it's important with our immunity. Now, it's also in our food. So we take in histamine in our food and drink, and we are making it and storing it. And so it has to be broken down by the body. And when there's an imbalance between what we're making and storing and eating and getting rid of the histamine, when there's an imbalance in that, the histamine is able to get very elevated in the body, and then it's toxic. So it causes like a massive allergic type reaction. So if you think of an allergy, if we have an insect bite, it's usually swollen, it's red, it's itchy. And if you take that to your whole body, people sometimes say they have hives, they have itchy skin, they have flushing with vasodilatation, they can have migraine, it can cause IBS type symptoms, it can cause rhinitis, sinusitis, shortness of breath. It can also, because it causes vasodilatation, these high levels of histamine in the body, people can have low blood pressure, they can get dizziness, fainting, and migraine. So it can cause so many symptoms. Not all the patients have all the symptoms, and they don't always have them all the time, because it will depend on their level of histamine on that particular day.
So what people with long COVID have been describing, can it also lead to this fatigue and brain fog that nearly everyone with long COVID seems to have?
Yes, totally. So the fatigue is very, very common. Brain fog is very common. Anxiety, people can get panic attacks. They can even get chest pain from it, aches and pains in their joints, and so on. So some of these patients may feel that they've been actually pretty healthy before, but this has exposed that this big viral exposure has increased their histamine levels, and their mast cells have produced even more histamine in their body, and it has really shown that they've got this propensity and this weakness, if you like. About 2 to 3% of the population have a genetic predisposition to having high histamine, because they don't make enough of the 2 enzymes that are used in the body to reduce the histamine levels and control the histamine in the body. And about 17% of the population, though, have mast cell activation syndromes, which go mostly undiagnosed and unrecognized in this country. So they're walking around thinking that they've just got a few chronic health issues, like IBS or chronic migraine, but actually their mast cells are not totally normal, and they're super sensitive, and keep them in a fairly high histamine state, which they can make worse if they eat certain foods, or they get a virus.
So some people are genetically predisposed to having high levels of histamine. Are there other people whose histamine levels could have been raised just by this virus that their body's never seen before?
Well, it is possible, and I am theorizing here, that that people can have relatively high levels of histamine, but they're just under, their body's just managing to keep it under control. So if they have a particularly high histamine meal, such as, particularly if it contains processed foods, or if it's got a lot of vinegar in it, or leftovers, that's a particularly high histamine meal, then their levels will go up and they won't feel particularly well, but then their body will rein it in and bring it under the toxic level, so they might feel fine again. But when they have the COVID-19 infection, it will cause a huge inflammatory response, and it will raise their histamine massively. And then, even though the COVID-19 has gone, they are left with this high histamine in their system, which will be causing further inflammation and symptoms. Because it's like a toxin, it's like being poisoned. People feel like they're being poisoned, and it can affect every single system in the body.
So this could be the case for those people, many of whom on the support groups saying, before COVID, I was perfectly fit and healthy. I ran, I was physically active. It could be that they were sort of just under levels where they were noticing any effects, but like you say, COVID has just tipped their histamine levels over the edge.
Yeah. And any virus could have done that. So we sometimes see patients who've got a history of having glandular fever or swine flu or chickenpox or something like that, a serious infection that then makes them chronically ill afterwards, and they never quite feel that they get back to normal after this big infection. And I think that we're just seeing that with COVID.
So why don't we know more about this, about histamine intolerance, and all these symptoms that you've described, that you see, and that I've described seeing in people with long COVID? There doesn't seem to be much information out there.
It's a relatively newly described condition. Having said that, it just goes very unrecognised and undiagnosed in this country. It's getting better. There is more information on the internet for people to find for themselves. But unfortunately, the medical profession, a lot of doctors we haven't been trained in it. And unless we have a particular interest in it, we may not have come across it as a diagnosis. And so often patients who have lots of different symptoms in different systems we'll see different consultants, maybe about a gastroenterologist, and then they might see a neurologist, they might see a dermatologist, but nobody's sort of pulling it all together because they haven't been taught about it. But I'm hoping that things are changing and that these patients are going to get more help. I see so many patients who've had chronic ill health for the whole of their lives, and they've never, ever had a diagnosis, and they've never had any constructive help. Although everyone's been very well-intentioned and tried to be as helpful as possible, they've had lots of tests, but they always come back normal. So then nobody quite knows what to do with them next, and they're missing this diagnosis.
Yeah, that's exactly what people with long COVID are describing, that if they get help from their GP, it's going to see perhaps different departments, different consultants for different things. So if people suspect that this could be them, what can they do about it?
Well, I think it would be really useful for us to do a bit of research and for us to gather some information about their symptoms, their previous history, and see if we can make a link. And I'm working with an app called People With, which is a free app to download, and we can track people's symptoms and have a look at that. So that's the first thing. I think it would be fantastic if people could download that and we could start gathering information and seeing if my hypothesis is correct. But also, I think these patients need to be having a discussion about histamine intolerance and mast cell activation with their doctors, looking at information on the internet that is out there, and seeking somebody who can actually help them with this, because it's not a particularly easy condition to get better from, but it's certainly because there's lots that we can do to help people. Yeah.
And there are certain things that you might eat or drink that you might think are healthy, and actually they're making things worse, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So certain foods can actually, and drinks can actually block the diamine oxidase enzyme that is required by the body to reduce the amount of histamine going into the body from your food. And you may be making an inadequate amount of diamine oxidase, and then if you have lots of tea and coffee and green tea and alcohol and things like that to drink, then you're actually stopping what little diamine oxidase you do have from working. And so you're sort of tripping yourself up and making things worse. And also I see lots of patients who have, as I say, been chronically unwell, and they are so desperate to feel well. They eat a lot of healthy foods, which are things like avocados and tomatoes and spinach. And these are really high histamine foods, and that just makes them worse, actually. So if they know which foods are high histamine and low histamine, they can try and control their diet, reduce their intake. And then we try and give type 1 and type 2 antihistamines and various other drugs to try and help sort of calm things down once the histamine's in the body.
So you hope that with this app, you can look at the symptoms that people are experiencing from day to day and see if that is a fit with histamine intolerance or mast cell activation. And if you can gather that, you want people to download this app, if you can gather all that information, it sounds like then there could be some answers for people with long COVID.
Absolutely, absolutely. We would have the information that we need to be able to present it to the medical profession and help more people, which would be amazing.